Hello, everyone, and welcome to Season 4, Episode 4 of Energy versus Climate. My name is Ed Whittingham, and as always, I'm joined by my webinar co-hosts, Sara Hastings-Simon and David Keith. So this week, climate is back in the news in a big way with the start of COP27 in Egypt. Yesterday, we had UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres warning of a chronicle of climate chaos in his speech. When it comes to energy versus climate news, EVC listeners and viewers know that the International Energy Agency, or IEA, is always in the mix. And you might know IEA as an influential international NGO with a bunch of member companies. It provides policy advice to those member countries around energy security, energy poverty, and economy-wide decarbonization. And in contrast to most energy think tanks out there, it's Paris-based. So it probably doesn't have the same challenges recruiting top talent compared to the rest of us. Lastly, you probably know the IEA for its flagship publication, the World Energy Outlook series. It's published each year, and the WEO, it's a leading source of scenario-based analysis of global energy demand and supply. And this year's WEO, the 2022 version in particular, explores the impact of short-term volatility in energy markets that we've been experiencing from things like the war in Ukraine, with still this long-term trend of decarbonization. So that's our topic today on our show, a deep dive on WEO 2022. What are the key findings, the analysis and insights? What does it tell us about the potential pathways for the world's energy future? And of course, what are the implications for Canada? And what better way to do a deep dive than to go to the source? And in this case, the IEA's chief energy economist and co-lead of the World Energy Outlook series, Tim Gould. So Tim provides strategic advice on energy economics, investments, and finance across a range of the IEA's activities. Prior to joining the IEA in 2008, he was a specialist on Russian and Caspian energy and worked on Eastern European energy issues, primarily in Ukraine. So in Tim today, we have a preeminent source to comment, of course, on the energy implications of the war in Ukraine, as we did with Gernot Wagner last month. Tim's academic training was at Oxford University and the School of Advanced International Studies, Johns Hopkins University. And today he's joining us from Paris, where he'll be for the next few days until traveling to Egypt and COP27 on Thursday. So welcome, Tim.
Thanks very much, Ed. It's a great pleasure to join you.
So the format for today's show, we're going to start with a primer on the 2022 World Energy Outlook with Tim. I'll then guide us through some questions with all of us until 40 or 45 minutes after the hour, and then we'll leave 15 minutes for Q&A. And for the Q&A, feel free to send in your questions via the Q&A box throughout the webinar. And thanks, as always, for not using the raise hand function or the chat box. So let's get down to it. Let's start with a primer. Tim, first, what is the World Energy Outlook? And maybe give us an introduction, like what is energy scenario modeling to begin with?
Thanks very much, Ed. And as you mentioned, the International Energy Agency is intergovernmental. We advise governments on all sorts of policy areas, but we do that on the basis of data. We try and collect an evidence base for what's happening in the energy sector. And then an extension of that is the work that we do with the World Energy Outlook, because we deploy all of that latest data on technologies, on markets, on what's happening in individual countries. And we try and think through what the future of energy might look like. And we do that not because we want to establish what exactly the energy world is going to look like in 2030 or 2040, but because we think that if you understand the levers that affect different ways that the energy system could evolve over time, then you have a better chance of improving your decision making today. So we have different scenarios for energy, which we can come back to in a second, and they're all differentiated by the choices that are made, primarily by governments, but not just by governments. And using that insight, we hope then to be able to go back to countries and say, well, look, if you carry on doing what you're doing today, then you will run into these kinds of risks. So perhaps you need to think about doing something slightly differently, which will present you with a more secure and sustainable energy future. So that's really what energy scenario modeling is all about. It's about thinking through potential different energy futures. We try and reflect all the complexity of today's energy system. So it has a very granular representation of all the different technologies that are used for heating, for light, for cooling, for mobility. And then we think through how they might evolve over time in response to different cost or policy stimuli. And so we might be able to meet our future demand for energy services in more sustainable, more secure ways than we do at the moment.
Got you. So just going back quickly to energy scenario modeling, I remember talking to Jeremy Bentham of Shell, who led Shell's energy modeling for many years. And I think of it kind of like signposts. It's their plausible predictions of the future, but for the people receiving them, they're also a set of signposts that if X is playing out, then you might consider Y in your choices. Is that a sort of a reasonable interpretation?
Yeah, I think very much so. The only area where I would take slight issue is the idea that we have a forecast of where we'll end up. We are very careful not to present our long-term scenarios, any of them, as forecasts. What we would like people to do with them is just to use them as a framework for thinking about the future of energy. To say, well, I understand more or less that if we do that, then we may end up there. And if we move in that direction, that'll affect emissions in a certain way, or it'll affect our import bill for fossil fuels in a certain way. And so you have a way of orienting your expectations and your decisions today based on a fairly transparent and easy to understand system for looking at the future.
Okay, well, thanks. That's helpful. And now let's get to the World Energy Outlook 2022 specifically. What are some of the key findings? And I think of the factors in the mix. There's so many things going on right now. We've got Ukraine, rising energy prices, creating energy poverty, coal and oil demand back up. But then we've also got new policies like we talked about last time, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, that seem to be turbocharging clean energy investment. So how do you make sense of all those drivers?
Well, I think the starting point is a system under extreme strain. So you have all sorts of symptoms of that, and of course prices are very much in people's minds. But let's not forget 2021 also a record year for energy-related emissions as well. So we have to deal with multiple aspects of a crisis, and what we're also very well aware of is the way that energy plays through into other phenomenon that are destabilizing countries at the moment. So the links between energy and food security, for example, in many low-income countries, or the way in which accumulated emissions are leading to increasingly visible signs of climate change. So I think our starting point is that we could see in the near term the results of today's crisis, exacerbated, intensified by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But what we really wanted to examine was, what about the reactions to today's crisis? What do they tell us about the way that the future might evolve? So we're looking not just at the immediate high prices caused by shortfalls in Russian deliveries of gas to Europe, for example, or the way that that reverberates around the world through LNG markets. But also looking at, so what are governments doing? And as you mentioned, there are all sorts of things are now in play in Europe with the Fit for 55 package, which is part of Europe's strategy to bring down emissions, but now reinforced by something called Repower EU, which is a specific response to today's crisis, trying to bring down reliance on imported Russian fuels. Or in the United States, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a big deal when it comes to action on all sorts of clean energy technologies. Or there's the Green Transformation Program in Japan, or continued progress with India's solar revolution. So all of these things are leading to a slightly different set of parameters for the future of energy and compared to where we were a year ago. And our task was to really think through what that all means.
Gotcha. And we're going to unpack that more in a little bit. And, in your WEO 2022, you've kind of got this guiding question is, everything that's been happening recently, is it a boost for clean energy, or is it a setback for clean energy? So we'll unpack that more. But the WEO 2022 outlines three scenarios, and the scenarios, and you described it as, think of it as three frameworks for thinking about energy. One being stated policy scenario, the other being announced pledges scenario, and then a third being net zero emissions by 2050 scenario. Can you just give us like a surface level quick introduction to the three?
So our sense is that decision makers need to have a few points of orientation. So the stated policy scenario is an indication of the direction of travel. So we look at today's policy settings and we ask the question, given that starting point, what does that mean for the evolution of the energy system over time? And then we ask a different question. So what would happen if we gave governments the benefit of the doubt and they achieved all of the targets that they set for themselves? So all of those net zero emissions pledges, all of those NDCs and various other country-specific pledges, and including also things that companies are talking about. Supposing all of that was fulfilled on time and in full, that would take us in a different direction. And what would that direction look like? And then both of the scenarios I've just talked about are so-called exploratory scenarios. So you fix a set of starting conditions and then you see where they lead. But there's another way to think about scenario modeling, which is you fix the endpoint and you work your way back to the present. And that's what we do in the so-called net zero emissions by 2050 scenario, which net zero emissions by 2050, if you get there in a reasonably direct way, that gives you a decent chance of limiting the rise in global average temperatures to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. And so that scenario works back from the endpoint and tries to give people insights on what it would take to get there. And so if you compare where you're heading with where you need to be to hit a desirable goal like a 1.5 degree stabilization, and you compare those two scenarios, you give yourself a sense of what's the remaining task in front of decision makers worldwide in order to get us from that sort of path of current travel to one that hits that long-term target. And those kinds of insights that we can do at country level or for different fuels or technologies to give a sense of the gap that remains before we end up in a better place for the global energy system.
Got you. But before we get to whether we're getting to that better place or not, it's worth bringing in David. And David, you wrote a paper, and I want to say 12 or 13 years ago, talking about energy models and the limitations of them and how should we use them. I'd love to hear if you could sort of lift the text off the page of that paper.
Well, that's thanks very much. And sorry if my audio is a little bit noisy today or echoey. I'm in a new house and I haven't had time to get the right equipment here. I think that paper and many other things, including an effort by a whole bunch of us as a formal US government product, I'll point out some issues about the way IPCC and other efforts like IEA do these scenario-based analysis. And maybe I talk about two. One is a real basic one, which is just being clear about what our ability to predict the future is. And the only way to know that really is to go backwards and look at how effective, how accurate prior energy forecasts were. And in general, you find that there's quite a lot of skill in predicting things on kind of a half decade to decade time scale. And there's very little skill when you look farther ahead than that. Now, it could be that all of us, including me, I suppose, energy academics are just much better than the old guys, and we really know how to make projections now. But I don't see evidence that we're fundamentally better at doing it. And I think the error in the projections that we've made before, sort of 30 years out, have typically been of order unity, like factor 2 errors. We're just really not able to do this. And so I think it's important to see where you see all these details in there, that they're not presented with uncertainty or with much understanding of what kinds of factors shape the underlying uncertainty. The second big comment is what Tim said already in this interview, is that it's not a forecast, it's a framework. So that's exactly what most people who are doing these scenarios, I guess, kind of have to say. It's what the IPCC tries to say, but it's a bit of a dance. It's obviously partly a forecast. It's not like you random draw from all possible states of the world, When you look at the stated policy scenario, there's all sorts of questions about how you interpret these policies, and then there's a bunch of technological assumptions underneath, and all those things are basically some level of forecast. If they truly weren't forecast, we wouldn't spend any time on them. So I think one of the things that formal US government effort tried to say is that you really can't have it both ways, that these things are in fact widely used as something that is trying to say something predictive about the future. And I mean, actually, I sound kind of negative, to be positive. Tim and others at the IEA have an enormous amount of data and really have lots of ability to say something about the future. So I think what I would push back on is the kind of thing that you work very hard to say something, and then you say, well, when you critique that maybe it might not have enough uncertainty or something, you say, well, it's just a framework, not a prediction. The answer is it's kind of a bit of both. I think it is true there's these very different kinds of predictions. That is the one that is working backwards versus forwards. I think have a really different implementation. I guess the one last thing to say is just the sort of way that the IEA's politics have kind of now moved along with framework convention. So they're really different agencies with different goals, and yet IEA has kind of adopted the kind of 1.5 framing and even adopted the goalpost moving of, the original 1.5 was about getting to 1.5, and now this is saying getting to 1.5 by the end of the century after we've gone over 1.5, and it's not really stabilization either. So I think there's a lot hidden under here that is, I think, politically necessary or seems to be necessary, but is not, I think, as clearly as it could be communicating what we know, what the uncertainties are.
Yeah, I think there's some great points in there. I think there's always a slight tension between the needs to simplify and to be able to explain what you've done, and the underlying complexity of both of the energy system itself and of the process of putting these kinds of scenarios together. I mean, you mentioned that if these weren't forecasts, then we wouldn't be spending any time on them. I'm not entirely convinced by that, in the sense that if you look at each of those scenarios, all of them, in a sense, has a fatal flaw, which would prevent it from being treated as a forecast. So in the stated policy scenario, for example, the flaw there is the idea that policies won't evolve from where they are today. They clearly will. And we're very explicit about that. And we're saying, in fact, not just they clearly will, but they very much need to, in order to address some of the things that the scenario highlights. So in a sense, the intention of that scenario is not to be right, it's to provoke action amongst policymakers today because of the deficiencies that it reveals in that pathway. And likewise, if you look at the announced pledges scenario, which is the one where all of these commitments are met in time and in full. Well, clearly that's also an unrealistic assumption. We're all familiar with the actions of governments around the world. It's very rare that they hit their targets in time and in full. But that scenario also performs a useful function because it gives a sense of, well, what's the gap in terms of ambition between the outcome of that scenario and the 1.5 degree target. So when you're thinking about NDCs or you're thinking about long-term climate strategies, by how much would they need to be enhanced, improved, in order to get us on track for that normative outcome that we have in the net zero emissions by 2050 scenario? And then in the 1.5 degree scenario, if, as we hope, we end up limiting the rise in global average temperatures to 1.5 degrees, we're almost certainly not going to do it in the way that is outlined in that scenario. We will find a different way to do it because along the way there will be events, there will be conflicts, there will be technologies that come through faster than we expect. And so it's a question of continually updating the scenario that we have for a new starting point and for a new range of technology costs, and to think, well, in today's circumstances, this would be a way to hit that goal. So I do take your points, but I feel somehow that if you look at these scenarios in the way that certainly we would intend them to be treated, then you can get a lot of value from that without necessarily treating them as a sort of forecasting instrument.
Maybe very quickly. So I really agree, clear answer about that difference. I think the important thing to say is, of course, there's the assumptions might be wrong. Of course, governments won't do what they said. No disagreement there. I think the point is there's I think the IEA could do a better job doing is saying something about the uncertainty given the assumption. So if you take as totally given the government's stated policies are exactly what they say, there's still actually lots of uncertainty under there. Uncertainties in technologies, uncertainties in other policies. And I think so that is an element of a forecast, even you said so. And I think the uncertainty in that forecast, which isn't if then, still has uncertainty, I think maybe quite a bit.
No, I think that's a very valid point. And when you look at the way that we describe the methodology for that stated policy scenario, when we take an individual piece of legislation or a policy announcement, we will make a judgment in that scenario as to the feasibility or the ease with which that may be implemented over time, or the financial, institutional, or other things that may affect the speed of implementation. And those judgments, I agree, we need to be transparent about how we arrived at those judgments in order for people to understand exactly the way that scenario plays out.
I want to bring in just one other perspective on sort of where one of the big gaps that I see, which is actually not within the scenarios themselves, but in the way that they're used and communicated by others. And there, I think, to me, if I could wave a magic wand, the one thing that I would change is the way that you hear governments and companies picking, it's like pick your favorite scenario and say, well, the IEA says this is going to happen. Therefore, whatever it is, therefore our economic policy makes sense, therefore our business case makes sense. And I think that is, well, aside from being a major pet peeve for me, that's really not using the scenarios in the way that they are intended. But I do think that it leads to a lot of confusion, right? And so I think there is something in kind of, and maybe it's the role of the journalists that are reporting on this, or others that are engaging with it, to really not let those kinds of claims go by unchallenged. Because we certainly see those, bringing that back to the Canadian perspective. Certainly every year after the WEO comes out, you see all kinds of comments coming from governments in Canada and companies saying, the IEA says, pick the reference scenario, say that oil demand is going to grow for the next so many years, therefore our business plan makes sense. Whereas I think the way to use that really is to say, under these, there are a few different potential futures that we could see, and here's what would happen under each of those. And so that's kind of the gap that I see, which is less, I think, on the side of what the IEA is doing and even how you're communicating, because I think that is stated pretty clearly. But nonetheless, we do see that showing up, and I think that's something that we need to fix more internally within our country and within the way that we're talking and using these scenarios.
Great. Let's sorry, if I can move us, I'm just keeping an eye on the time. I do want to get to this key question that is posed by the 2022 World Energy Outlook, and that is today's energy crisis a boost or a setback for energy transitions? And maybe we can start on a specific point. And we know that in order to stay within a 2C or 1.5C limit, we need electricity, its share in global final energy consumption to rise. We need to electrify the world, including heat and mobility. And right now, though, on the short-term trend, and we've talked about this, we're seeing coal and natural gas, its share in electricity generation, rising. But at the same time, we're still seeing these massive turbocharging policies that are boosting what will likely be investment in clean electricity production, renewables, clean hydrogen, et cetera. So, Tim, back to you. Maybe just do your best. And I know the most likely answer is it depends, but could you try to answer that question that the WEA poses around it being a boost or a setback for energy transitions?
Well, our strong feeling is that because of the way that governments are responding to today's crisis, this could be seen in a few years' time when we look back as quite an important turning point on the history of energy. And it's undoubtedly true that at times of crisis, people will use whatever energy is available and most affordable. And it's true also that there has been higher coal use for power generation this year. But the higher use of coal for power generation, the rise this year, is less than the increase in solar. It's less than the increase in wind. And in our view, that rise will be temporary, because over time, the cost benefits of moving towards a cleaner electricity system are just very much stacked in favor of clean energy technologies. So by the end of this decade, even if you're just taking today's policy settings, so that's stated policies world that we spoke about, you will have seen quite a noticeable peak in global power sector CO2 emissions. You will see significant increases in wind and solar generation. You'll see, particularly in China, in the European Union, in the US, quite some strides made towards the electrification of mobility, which of course takes the edge off oil demand as well. So even today's policy settings are now strong enough to achieve some quite dramatic changes in the way we use energy. And one of the very symptomatic findings that supports that view is that in that scenario, which is today's policy settings, we do see a peak in overall fossil fuel demand before the end of this decade. Now, that's not, I mean, that we need to recognize that for what it is. It's quite an important moment in energy history because fossil fuel use has risen every decade since the start of the Industrial Revolution. And fossil fuel emissions have risen every decade since the start of the Industrial Revolution. So the moment at which we part company is a very important moment in energy history. However, that parting of the ways is not yet dramatic enough to get us towards safe ground from a climate perspective. So an awful lot more needs to be done. But let's also recognize some glimmers of hope where we can see them.
Maybe just to
go ahead, Sara.
I just wanted to jump in on that parting because I think that is, a really interesting point in terms of it's definitely not enough, and sustaining fossil fuel use at the level that we have now or slightly below obviously is still very problematic from a climate perspective. But as you say, Tim, it's very significant from a historical perspective, and I think that also can then become quite significant in terms of a lot of our sort of known facts around the way that these markets work have been developed during this very long history of sustained growth for fossil fuels. And so I think that is something to me that, it's not even, it doesn't necessarily come out in the data that's presented around how those trajectories change. But I think when we think about the business that sits behind fossil fuels, both from, obviously the companies that are involved in it, but also governments that are building and maintaining infrastructure, we have so much knowledge that has been generated and has come out of this period of that sustained growth. And so when that changes, I think there can be very significant ways in which those markets change that we are, maybe not prepared for or certainly don't have that kind of intuition, right? And so I think a lot of our intuition around those markets will start to be challenged if we see that fundamental shift in the overall demand.
Just quickly, I think the idea of fossil peaking this decade is the most exciting thing by far in this report. I also believe it. I think that this is a near-term forecast where IEA has a lot of insight. I think it is, in the sense, kind of a forecast. And I think it's profoundly important. So I really do think it is a turning point. I think it's important this isn't a climate thing, but we refer to it, not to fall into the trap of over-interpreting the way some of the activist community want us to interpret it. There isn't a safe at 1.5 above and below. That's not what the science said. And I think it's really important not to fall into the trap of doing that. There were sensible reasons why people use that as a motivator for policy, but it's not true.
Tim, just a question back to you on that. So I agree. I think it's exciting, but the report is also clear that energy poverty is growing right now, and that puts a number to it. 75 million people who had access to electricity are likely to lose the ability to pay for it. And as we're seeing the peak and ultimate decline of fossil fuels, whether it be coal or oil or natural gas, then we're also needing to see a tripling of investment in clean energy infrastructure. So we're seeing that in some parts. And I've talked about IRA, you've talked about Europe, you've talked about the Green Plan in Japan, but I don't think we're seeing that globally yet. And at every COP27, we go through the gnashing of teeth and rolling of eyes around how much developed countries are actually going to pay for developing countries to change out their infrastructure. So that tripling of clean energy investment has to happen in those less developed countries. I guess, do you see that happening as we ease off fossil fuels and that clean electricity coming in as a replacement in those places where energy poverty is the highest?
So that's a really key question there. And the sad truth is that we don't yet see that clean energy investment picking up in many emerging and developing economies in the way that we would need to. And pretty much all of the increase that we've seen thus far in clean energy spend has come from advanced economies and China. So there is the risk of a new kind of dividing line on energy and climate if we don't make considerably more effort to build bridges and to unlock flows of capital to clean energy projects across many parts of the developing world. And that also, of course, relates to the question of energy access. We've been tracking energy access for many years, and this is the first time that at global level we've seen an uptick in the number of people worldwide without access to electricity. So that's an alarming trend that certainly needs to be, that needs to be a focus for international action on energy. I would like to, though, pick up one other thing that Sara was mentioning, because I think she's absolutely right, that as we move into a world in which fossil fuels are no longer growing, we enter a different dynamic for the energy system, one where you have all sorts of issues emerging around the coexistence of that legacy system, the fossil fuel system, and the growing clean energy one. And I've been very, I was reading with a lot of interest the work that Sara's been doing on this, and from academic papers and so on, and that notion of sort of mid-transition energy security issues, I think is a really useful framework for thinking through how we maintain energy security throughout that process of change.
Sara, that seems like a nice softball to you to plug the work,
yeah, sure,
exciting work you've been doing
say a little bit
transitions.
More about that. So that's some work that I've done with Emily Grubert, and we really were looking at sort of, this is a paper that kind of lays out more questions than answers in some sense, but talks about, so I was talking about kind of the intuition that we have around markets being different, but actually also the systems themselves, of course. If we take the electricity sector, for example, and it's been run in a certain way for many, many decades, where it's been reliant on large fossil plants that can largely be dispatched to respond to changing demand. We can model, and many people have modeled what a efficient, highly decarbonized electricity system would look like. We've talked about that on the show before around, having very flexible demand, having, energy storage, having integration of large grids. But what I think we talk about less is this middle period where you start to have each system has its own sort of optimal way of operating, if you want. And when the new system, let's say, is small enough, it doesn't really impose operational constraints on the old one. And when we get to the end of the transition, that will again also be different. But there is this sort of middle time where you have these two systems that are each operating less, sort of constrained or more constrained by the other than they would be on their own. Which then, and layer on top of that, this idea that we're also now entering a world where we are starting to see impacts of climate change as well, too. So not only do the systems have to deal with constraints that come from kind of operating together, but we actually layer on, new constraints that they're dealing with more extreme weather, having to respond in ways they never had before. And that is going to create challenges that are sort of different and, need to be considered when we think about also, what an efficient transition pathway looks like, understanding what those constraints are, and really understanding where, when we're in them as well too. So, I think it raises a lot more questions than answers at this point, but it's something that's important to consider. And, one possible answer and way to deal with that is to say that, we should endeavor to make this mid-transition period as short as possible, right? And that even if it costs us more to go faster, which in some cases, it doesn't, and this new paper from Dwayne Farmer out of Oxford I have it sitting here, empirically grounded technology forecasts and the energy transition suggests that in some ways faster transitions can be less costly. But even if it's more costly to go faster, it might be cheaper overall because we spend less time in this, more complicated middle space. So definitely a lot of, a lot more questions to answer as we think about what that transition looks like.
And one of the questions to answer is what this all means for Canada as a major oil and gas producing country. So Mac, sorry, looking at Tim, the IEA does lots of work looking at doing country level assessments. What can you say about what this means for Canada's plausible future?
I think it raises a number of kind of big and important questions. I mean, on the one hand, you have, the increased urgency around climate and emissions, and part of that is also the impact of today's crisis on the outlook for gas demand in developing countries in Asia. Because clearly part of Canada's international strategy is also to look to provide gas, which is, demonstrably clean, we hope, to Asian importers as part of their own transition. But I think we have to be aware that today's high prices have shaken trust in strategies that rely on imported natural gas. And so in our view, the room for gas to play that sort of partially constructive role in aiding the emissions reductions in carbon-intensive economies in Asia, that room has shrunk compared to where we were in our previous outlook. On the other hand, the way that many importing countries, particularly in advanced economies, but not only, look at their import requirements is they do attach an increased premium now to reliability, to countries they feel are going to be there for them when they need it. And I think Canada scores highly on that count. And so this notion about the kind of Canada as an energy security provider, that's something which is also a good question that's raised by our projections. There's no way at the moment of valuing that type of contribution in the same way that there's no way of valuing the additional value coming from, in a sense, low emissions intensity of production, if you can actually get there. But I think those are a couple of the very interesting areas that are raised by our new outlook for Canada.
Great. I will note, as the European powerhouses like Germany have been hoovering up natural gas reserves to tie them through this winter, which they will. While Canada is a good friend and, chancellors and prime ministers exchange visits all the time, what does Germany do is they turn to the Qataris and hoover up their supply, while also helping to make it less affordable, unfortunately, for some of the Southern European countries. But sorry, Tim, I said that, and provocatively, you want to jump in.
I think there's a really interesting question here, and it's something that many European importing countries are grappling with, because Europe has a kind of 5-10 year gas problem. But any gas supplier has a 20-year horizon. And so there's continually this mismatch in time expectations that's very visible in some of the discussions that the Europeans have been having with a number of international suppliers, insofar as they want to underpin new investments in gas. And that raises all sorts of interesting questions about how do you solve short-term problems with a long-term industry. And you can think creatively about that, but I feel that there's a lot more thinking that could be done as to how to make some of those investments, if indeed they take place, more compatible with a decarbonizing energy system.
The other thing that I, read with interest, obviously, is some of the numbers behind oil production in Canada under the different scenarios that are laid out, right? And kind of the shift, obviously, from, I think in 2021, we're at something like 5.6 million barrels per day. And, whether that's in the stated policy scenario, where that does, increase somewhat, or the announced pledges where that starts to then fall off, by 2040, we're seeing that down to 4.1, at least in the announced pledges scenario. I think that one of the other pieces that's an important part of that conversation, though, when we think about the impact for Canada, is on the value of that production, right? And obviously, you also see these very different prices that, as I understand, are really determined, by sort of the underlying economics of the fields that are required to be produced. Obviously, you're going to continue to have volatility like we're seeing and have always seen within oil markets for all kinds of different reasons. But I think that one important implication for Canada is both, what it means for growth in demand for Canadian oil and gas, and what that means for, jobs and kind of employment, where, seeing that level off or even drop means a dramatic decline there. But then also, certainly even as Canada through, 2050 may continue to produce oil and gas in these different scenarios, the value of that will be significantly lower, and that obviously has major implications both for companies but also for governments as well. Sitting in Alberta, where that's obviously a major driver of revenue for our governments, also where I think that planning becomes important. And then I come back to I think Tim, you were talking about the idea that one of the roles of the WEO is to kind of help governments understand how decisions they make will play out. I think oil and fossil fuel producing regions like Canada have sort of a double piece there, which is, their own climate policies have some impact, but actually perhaps more importantly, it's the climate policies of the rest of the governments around the world, and, whether they really implement policies that put us on the, announced pledges track, which, arguably Canada doesn't have a lot of influence over what other governments are doing, but sort of just that message of, we really have different potential futures that we may be facing. And if there's not a lot that, we can do in Canada around which one we're going to be on, then it's really around preparing for, for both, if you want.
Why don't we turn to questions? We've got lots of questions, and it's a hot topic, and we have a super guest. So I've seen just in our chat here, Mac Van Wiedelgen of people will know him in this part of the country. His long association with ARC Financial and ARC Resources. You've got a question just around net zero timing and international cooperation. So Mac, turning it over to you.
Yeah, Ed, can you hear me?
Yep. Yeah, you're coming through, Mac.
Okay.
Welcome.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And I really appreciate the quality of the conversation this morning. At least this morning where I am. The question I had, Tim, relates to the.
We just lost Mac. I'll give it a couple of seconds, and then if not, I'm just scrolling up here. Sorry, Mac, your audio cut out.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now. You're back.
Okay. Look, I'm going to ask the question quickly. In the 2050 roadmap report, there was a section in there that analyzed as a sensitivity what would happen if international cooperation was weak. That the 2050 scenario assumed a sustained strong level of international cooperation. Absent that, you literally forecast, or you've got as a scenario, that 2050 becomes 2090. And it surprised me there hasn't been more, at least I haven't been aware of more public discussion on that particular assumption. And it seems particularly relevant right now, given geopolitical conflict that exists. That's my question. Thank you very much.
Mac, I'm delighted that you paid such close attention to the work we did last year, and I think you're completely right. This is an incredibly important variable. Because we did find that the magnitude of the changes required to get to net zero emissions by 2050, they work if everyone is pulling in the same direction, and that there is this broad understanding and collaborative understanding of the need to work together, so that people can take advantage of gains from technology cost reductions in certain countries, that people can pool the benefits from demonstration projects and so on. Yeah, again, you're absolutely right. That's not the world that we see when we look around now. We have a world of geopolitical upheaval. We have a world where there is huge competition and potentially fragmentation of some of those clean energy value chains. Many of those clean energy value chains are highly concentrated and present some risks of their own. And so there's a huge amount of effort and investment and policy energy going into ensure that those are more diverse and more resilient. So I think, yeah, this is a significant question. I mean, when we looked at it again this year, we found that, you know, there was still a pathway that we could see from where we are today to a net zero emission system by 2050. But let's not imagine that this is a particularly easy one. It is an increasingly narrow pathway, and it really requires a huge international effort to get on track for that. And again, coming back to something that we've just discussed, one of the most important questions is how to give a broad coalition of countries a sort of stake in the new energy economy. How can we have a sufficiently open international system, and how can we open up flows of capital, particularly to some developing economies, that they can start to feel already the benefits of participation in that dramatic change that we need to see in the global energy system. But I think you raise an excellent question.
And Tim, just a quick follow-up question to that. So we've got a new Cold War following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I mean, foreseeably, Vladimir Putin, if he were to show up at COP27, you know, maybe he would be, you know, given amnesty by the Egyptians, but anywhere else he steps foot in a NATO country and, you know, arguably he's going to be arrested on site and accused of war crimes. So we've got this new Cold War. No NATO country, at least, can engage in any kind of real cooperation with Russia. And it remains a major producer of oil and especially gas for the entire world. So what's the net? And I know, and I'm sort of giving you a bit of a softball question because the WAO talks about this. What's the net impact on Russia following the invasion and its isolation? And is that actually good for emissions, or is it bad for emissions, given the fact that it's not going to be party to any international climate agreement?
I think, I mean, where we ended up was that today's crisis leaves Russia with a much diminished place in global energy. As things stand, Russia's by a distance the largest fossil fuel exporter in the world. It's about 50%. Exports about 50% more than the second largest, which is Saudi Arabia. But Russia is in the process of losing its largest and most profitable export market, which is Europe. And in our view, the trust that you need in order to have that sort of energy relationship has simply disappeared. So we don't see that there's a way back for Russia or for the Russia-EU energy relationship, or the gas relationship in particular. And it is difficult for Russia to switch those resources that used to come to Europe to other markets. Oil is marginally simpler, but gas is really tricky because there's all sorts of infrastructure questions involved. And the sanctions that are in place that affect Russia's access to capital and access to technology, they will also affect how rapidly Russia can develop new resources or new LNG projects. So that all feeds into quite a significant scaling back of Russia's role in international energy. Now, does that help or hinder transitions in itself? That's a slightly difficult question to answer. But I think, as I said earlier, you know, the crisis that has been provoked by Russia's invasion of Ukraine has now given us a policy sort of push to all sorts of changes in the international system that will help to bring down emissions in the future.
All right, let's bring in another questioner. We've got Karen Spencer. Over to you to ask your question of Tim.
Okay. Tim, my question for you is on the scenarios in your report there. And I apologize that the information is probably there and I just haven't dug deep enough. But I'm just wondering, when you're modeling the production as it flattens and declines, allocating from the producing countries. In Canada, we would love to be the last producer standing, have the robust part of our economy continuing to go on oil and gas as we transition. But cost-wise, we just may not be able to compete with Qatar and Kuwait and OPEC in general. And as we see right now, where is Europe going for, and Germany's going for their resource filling the gap that is left with Russia. And so I really hear from what Mac was saying as well, collaboration versus competition, here in the old systems and then in the new systems. So, back to the modeling, do you really look that in depth country-wise, or is it much more at a global level and assuming some of that collaboration as you do it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in the near term, we look closely at existing contractual relationships and sort of existing flows, and assuming that there's a certain amount of inertia around those. But when we look out to the longer term for kind of residual needs, it is based, largely on cost. We assume that the resources that get developed, if they need to get developed in a given scenario, by and large those that are cheapest to develop. We have a certain way of mimicking the constraints arising from the existence of OPEC and the way that OPEC takes decisions, and that opens up some space in some scenarios for higher cost producers to come in. There's a sort of generic assumption that in relatively high demand scenarios, that countries will tend to try and stimulate domestic production where they can. But still, in most sort of decarbonization scenarios, it does come down to cost. And Canada, at least, certainly on the oil side, is not among the least cost producers around the world. Where we run into some more challenging judgments is in an environment like today, when there seems to be a premium on diversity and security. So that's when we start to have discussions about if any given region seems to be becoming too dependent on a single producer or a small group of producers, then we probably wouldn't react to it in the modeling, but we would certainly flag that as an analytical finding to say, this importing region or this importing country certainly needs to be aware that the way things are heading, if they don't act in a different way, they would become potentially dangerously dependent on a small group of suppliers.
David, over to you. Sure, I have a quick question, hopefully a little more specific, back to that earlier stuff about uncertainty. So my former student at Joe DeCarolis is, I'm very proud to say, now head of the IEA, the U.S. Energy Information Administration. And he did some beautiful work building really open source energy models. There's now quite a community working to more ways to do energy modeling in a way where everybody can see the full details of the assumptions. I know that's tough, but can you foresee a way that IEA could move towards that, opening the kimono a little bit more?
We're certainly aware of the sort of the free the models desire to see more transparency around the way that models operate. We do produce a lot of information on the methodology that we follow. I think the challenge here is that our model is, if you imagine all of the energy models in the world are basically arranged on a spectrum from simulation models to optimization models. Optimization models will tell you the cheapest way to achieve a certain outcome. They're often used in climate modeling. Simulation models are ones that really try to mimic the real world effects of policy. And so we are very much on that spectrum. So we are trying to think through not just the effect of a carbon price, but what about that policy that, you know, has a target for electric vehicles in 2035, or this policy that is looking for a building renovation, of retrofits of energy efficiency retrofits of such and such a percent by. And so essentially the work of the modelers is to constrain the model in such a way that mimics the outcome of that particular piece of policy. And so everything that we do is really a part of that interaction between the modeler and the sort of accounting framework, the model that they're working with. As such, it is a very labor-intensive model. There's 35 modelers working on different aspects of the model at any given moment when we're producing a scenario. So it's not something that you can easily put out there for use, because essentially everyone who's working on it has been trained to work on it. That said, we're very open to explaining what we do, and I, if there's easy ways for us to be more transparent about the way that we work, and then we're very open to those kinds of suggestions.
I just wanted to jump in on that. I think it ties back to my earlier point around some of the confusion that arises in these models due to the way that they're talked about, right? And sort of the difference between the use of the word scenario versus forecast. And I think that would apply very much in the open model as well, too, right? I mean, I think there are a lot of good reasons to move towards that. But in order to, have that really then kind of flow all the way through to influencing the way that policymakers and companies and even individuals are thinking about these models, that has to then be supported with, flowing through that information about what is open and what those choices are made to. So it's certainly not a simple, that's one, making the model open, I guess I would say is one piece of that, but those other pieces are required as well.
Just a quick note, one of our listeners, Nicola, pointed out that it was really not appropriate to me to use the opening the kimono phrase, and that's absolutely right. I agree, it's dinosauric. I apologize.
Okay.
Now over to you, Tim.
Well, let's actually squeeze in one more question. We're running out of time here. And we've got an interesting question from Scott Vaughan, who was Canada's Federal Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development for a time before he went on to head the International Institute for Sustainable Development. And he's got a question regarding China's decision to stop funding overseas coal-fired electricity development. That we're about a year into it. China's President Xi Jinping told the U.S. General Assembly about a year ago that they're going to support low carbon energy development in developing countries and not, by contrast, build any new coal-fired power project overseas. Tim, how does that factor into your scenarios, and maybe update us a year later? Do we actually see China fulfilling its pledge?
So the short answer on the second point is yes. I think that, as far as I'm aware, there haven't been any new new final investment decisions on Chinese-built coal power plants outside China. There've been quite a few within China, but I'm not aware of any outside. And this basically takes us back to what we were just discussing. That then becomes a piece of information that is useful for the modeler, because when they look at choices that might be made by Pakistan or Bangladesh or countries in Southeast Asia, the knowledge that China will not finance overseas coal, and that appears to be a credible commitment. That means that regardless of the economics of any new coal plant, that's just not going to be factored into our scenarios. So that's a good example of the way in which a policy commitment made by our government would then feed through into a constrained set of choices about how we meet electricity demand in certain countries.
Okay. I want to wrap us up at the end of the hour, so let's leave it at that. Tim, thank you so much. It was wonderful to get some of your time just days before you head over to Egypt for COP27 yourself, and following so quickly on the heels of the publication of the WEO 2022. So we feel like we're very lucky to have had you join us, and we've had a great webinar guest list today as well, joining in to hear what you have to say. So thank you very much.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right, everyone. A reminder, this episode is going to be available at energyversusclimate.com. and on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever else you listen. We always like it when you review and rate us using your favorite podcast platform. This always helps new listeners to find the show. If you have any feedback for us, you can send it to info@energyversusclimate.com. A reminder, some of you might know, we're in the midst of our fall appeal campaign. And by that, we're passing around our small EVC tin cup. Your listener support helps us to keep the show going. So check out energyversusclimate.com. And those are email subscribers. You would have received our appeal early last week. So we're grateful for the support. And thank you to Hannah Tai, Priya Kuni Kulato, Crystal Hickey, and as always, our producer, Eva Voinigescu, for their support. We look forward to seeing you in a couple weeks' time with a new show. Thanks, everyone, and bye-bye.